freezing salt water stinging his raw eyes. Dean didn't want to be a savior. He just wanted to finish his shift, pick up his son, and sleep for 12 unbroken hours. But when a body washes up in the violent November surf, you don't get to just walk away. He dragged her out, coughing up sand and bile, completely unaware he was saving a ruthless tech billionaire who would entirely upend his quiet, fractured life. Here is the story of a rescue that cost him everything and gave him everything back. Gravel crunched under Dean's work boots, the sound barely audible over the roar of the Pacific. November on the Oregon coast wasn't picturesque. It was a brutal wet assault. Rain lashed sideways, feeling like fistfuls of needles thrown against his cheeks. He tightened the collar of his canvas jacket, his fingers numb and stiff, clumsy as blocks of wood. He had 3 more private docks to inspect before he could clock out, collect his meager paycheck from the property management company, and go get Leo. His 6-year-old was probably sitting on Patty's frayed carpet right now, watching cartoons and eating off-brand fruit snacks. Dean's chest tightened. He was already 20 minutes late. Patty charged $1 for every minute past 6. He shined his heavy flashlight over the grey, churning water. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the violent froth of the surf, slamming against the retaining wall. He swept the light left, intending to check the moorings. Then he saw it. Just a flash of dark fabric twisting in the swell. A log, he told himself. A piece of netting? A trash bag dumped off a trawler. He moved the beam back. Hair. Black hair fanning out like spilled ink in the white foam. A pale hand breached the surface, limp before the wave swallowed it again. Dean froze. His stomach plummeted, hitting his boots. No, he thought, a purely selfish, exhausted panic flaring in his throat. Please God, no. Not today. He didn't want this. He didn't want the police reports, the hours of questioning, the wet clothes, the missed pickup. He just wanted to go home. The body surfaced again, slamming against a barnacle-encrusted piling. The sickening thud of bone on wood echoed over the wind. Dean dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the rocks, its beam shooting wildly into the sky. He swore, stripping off his heavy work jacket, his boots slipping on the slick, algae-covered stones as he scrambled down the embankment. The wind ripped the heat from his body the second his jacket was gone. He hit the water, and the cold was absolute. It felt like being crushed in a vise of solid ice. His lungs seized. He couldn't draw a breath. Water poured into his mouth, tasting strongly of salt copper and dead kelp. He gagged, fighting the instinct to turn around and crawl back to the safety of his miserable dry truck. He pushed forward, chest deep, then neck deep, the undertow immediately grabbing at his legs like desperate hands. "Hey!" he screamed, his voice swallowed instantly by the wind. A wave crashed over his head. Sand ground into his eyes. He surfaced, coughing, violently spinning in the dark water. The body was 10 feet away, drifting dangerously close to the jagged rocks of the breakwater. Dean kicked his muscles, burning every movement, fighting the heavy drag of his soaked jeans and thermal shirt. He reached her. He grabbed a fistful of heavy, sodden wool, a coat that must have cost more than his truck now acting as an anchor. He hauled her against him. She was dead weight. Her face was chalk-white lips, tinted a terrifying, bruised blue. "Come on, come on!" he grunted, wrapping his arm around her chest, kicking off the sandy bottom. The ocean didn't want to let her go. A swell rose behind them, lifting them both before slamming them down into the shallows. Dean hit the submerged rocks hard. Fire ripped up his shin. He tasted blood where he bit his tongue. He ignored it, grabbing her by the collar of her coat and dragging her backward, crawling on his knees through the receding foam. He hauled her onto the coarse, wet sand above the tide line. He collapsed beside her for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving, his lungs burning as if he'd inhaled glass. She wasn't breathing. Dean rolled her onto her back. Her skin was freezing. He pressed his fingers hard into her neck, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. Just cold, wet flesh. "Damn it!" he gasped. He didn't know CPR, not really. Just what he'd seen on television years ago. He locked his hands together, positioned them over the center of her chest, and pushed. Her sternum was rigid. He pushed harder, putting his back into it. Crack. The sound of her rib giving way was loud, a dry snap that made Dean's stomach churn. He flinched, pulling his hands back, but she still wasn't breathing. He had to keep going. He pressed again, ignoring the sickening shift of bone beneath his palms. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pinched her nose, clamped his mouth over her freezing lips, and blew. She tasted like expensive gin and seawater. He went back to her chest. Compressions. Breaths. His arms shook with exhaustion. The rain pelted his back. He was shivering so hard his teeth rattled, clicking loudly in his skull. "Breathe, you rich idiot!" He rasped, his voice cracking. "Breathe!" He pushed down again. Suddenly her body convulsed. A horrible, wet, rattling sound came from deep in her chest. She rolled to the side and violently vomited seawater, sand, and bile onto the rocks. Dean fell back onto the sand, swiping the back of his trembling hand across his mouth. He watched her gasp, her chest heaving irregularly as she choked on the air. She wasn't dead. She was alive, and she was making a pathetic, ragged sound. He didn't feel heroic. He felt nauseous. His shin throbbed with a blinding intensity, and he couldn't stop shivering. He looked at the woman shivering violently in her ruined designer coat, her black hair plastered to her skull. "All right," he muttered, forcing himself up onto his knees. "Let's get you in the truck." The heater in Dean's rusted Ford F-15 smelled like burning dust and stale French fries. It blasted lukewarm air directly onto the woman slumped against the passenger door. She was unconscious again, her head rattling against the window with every pothole Dean hit. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The dashboard clock read 6:45 p.m. Patty was going to kill him. $45 in late fees. That was groceries for a week. "Hang in there," he told the woman, not even sure if she could hear him. "Almost at the county general." She mumbled something incoherent, a weak, raspy sound, and shifted. Her hand fell onto the console. Dean glanced down. No wedding ring. A watch that looked like it was made of solid platinum. Who was this woman, and what was she doing walking the cliffs at night in weather that kept even the local fishermen indoors? He pulled into the emergency room drop-off zone, throwing the truck into park. The wipers squeaked against the glass. He jumped out the wind, immediately cutting through his soaked thermals, and ran around to the passenger side. He hauled her out. She groaned a sharp intake of breath. The broken rib. I know, I'm sorry," he grunted, practically carrying her through the automatic sliding doors. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the ER was blinding after the darkness of the storm. The smell of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and unwashed bodies hit him like a wall. A triage nurse looked up from her computer, her expression bored until she saw the trail of seawater and sand Dean was leaving on the linoleum. "Found her in the water," Dean said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Not breathing. Did CPR. She threw up a lot of water." 2 orderlies appeared with a gurney. Dean deposited her onto the thin mattress. Her head lolled. "Sir, we need your information," a clerk said, appearing beside him with a clipboard. "And hers, if you have it." "I don't know who she is," Dean said, taking a step back toward the doors. His clothes were heavy, dripping puddles onto the floor. "Just pulled her out. We still need your name and a statement for the police. They're on their way." "Police." The word echoed in Dean's tired brain. He thought of his truck outside, expired tags, a tail light out. He thought of his bank account overdrawn by $12. He thought of Leo waiting in a house that smelled of cheap cigarettes, wondering if his dad was ever coming. If he stayed, he'd be here for hours answering questions. He looked at the woman on the gurney. She was shaking uncontrollably, her lips still blue, the thin hospital blanket doing nothing to warm her. Dean stripped off the dry flannel overshirt he kept in the truck for emergencies, the one he had thrown on over his wet thermals in the parking lot. He tossed it over her chest. It wasn't much, but it was thick. "Tell the cops I was just a passerby," Dean said to the clerk. Before the clerk could protest, Dean turned and walked out into the rain. Sloane woke to the sensation of fire in her lungs and a stabbing agony in her chest. She gasped, her eyes flying open. The world was a blur of aggressive white ceiling tiles. A machine was beeping rhythmically next to her ear. Her throat felt raw, as if she had swallowed a handful of crushed glass. "Ms. Sloane, try not to move." Sloane turned her head, wincing. A nurse with a tired face was checking an IV line taped to the back of Sloane's hand. "Where?" Sloane croaked, her voice barely a whisper. It hurt just to push the word out. "County General," the nurse said, flatly, adjusting a dial on the monitor. "You had quite a night, near drowning, mild hypothermia, one fractured rib, presumably from the CPR." Sloane closed her eyes. The memories hit her in fragmented flashes. The cliffside path near her rental house, the sudden violent gust of wind, the slick mud, slipping, falling, the terrifying, freezing blackness of the water closing over her head. She remembered the panic, the absolute certainty that she, a woman who controlled a global logistics empire, was going to die alone in the dark because she wanted to look at the stupid waves. And then, a sudden, brutal yanking, the sickening crack in her chest, someone screaming at her to breathe, the taste of salt and something else. "Who?" Sloane asked, opening her eyes again. She hated feeling this weak. She hated the sterile smell of the hospital. "Who brought you in?" The nurse shrugged. "A guy. Didn't leave a name. Dropped you like a hot potato when he heard the police were coming. Probably had warrants. Happens a lot around here." Sloane frowned. The movement pulled at her cracked rib, making her wince. A criminal. Someone with warrants saved her life. She shifted her arms and felt something rough scratch against her chin. It wasn't a hospital blanket. She pulled it up slightly. It was a heavy, worn, red and black flannel shirt. She brought it to her face. It smelled deeply of sawdust, cheap pine soap, and a faint metallic tang that reminded her of old pennies. It didn't smell like a criminal. It smelled like a man who worked with his hands until they bled. It smelled remarkably intensely alive. The door to her room flew open. David, her executive assistant, rushed in. His tailored suit was completely out of place in the grim county hospital. He looked horrified. "Sloane. My God. The police called me. Are you all right? I have a private ambulance waiting outside. We're transferring you to St. Jude's in Portland immediately. I've already called your lawyers about the structural integrity of that cliff path." David was talking fast, organizing the chaos, doing exactly what she paid him an exorbitant salary to do. But Sloane barely heard him. She gripped the rough flannel shirt in her hand, her knuckles white. She remembered the sheer strength it took to pull her out of that undertow. She remembered the desperate, raw voice screaming at her to breathe. "David." She interrupted, her voice gravelly, but carrying the undisputed weight of authority. He stopped mid-sentence. "Yes, boss. Cancel the lawyers. Call security." She ran a thumb over a frayed buttonhole on the flannel. "Someone pulled me out of that water. A man in a truck. He left this." "Okay," David said, confused. Do you want to send him a reward I can handle that once we get you transferred? No, Sloane said, her dark eyes locking onto David's. The vulnerability of the near-death experience was already hardening, turning into something focused and sharp. I don't want to send him a check. I want to know who he is. I want a name, David. Find him. Morning dragged itself over the Oregon coastline, grey and reluctant. Dean woke before his alarm, his body rigid. The damp cold of the mobile home had settled into his joints overnight, but that was nothing compared to the violent screaming ache in his muscles. He tried to sit up, and a sharp spasm ripped through his lower back. He swallowed a groan, grinding his teeth together. Every movement was a brutal reminder of the freezing undertow and the dead weight of the woman he had dragged from it. He swung his legs over the side of the sagging mattress. His shin throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat. Pushing up his pajama pant leg, he inspected the damage. The rock had taken a jagged slice of skin right off the bone. It was angry red and weeping slightly into the cheap gauze he'd taped over it the night before. He didn't have time to redress it. The floorboards creaked under his bare feet as he walked to the kitchen. The linoleum was ice cold. He turned on the faucet, letting the rusty water run clear before filling the dented kettle. He needed coffee, the cheap, acidic grounds he bought in bulk. He needed to be awake. Dad! Dean turned. Leo was standing in the hallway, clutching a worn fleece blanket. His hair was sticking up in a static-charged mess. Hey, buddy, Dean said, forcing the rasp out of his voice. He plastered on a tired but stable smile. You're up early. It's cold, Leo murmured, shuffling forward. Dean dropped to one knee, ignoring the spike of pain in his shin, and pulled his son into a tight hug. Leo smelled like sleep, and the faint, stale cigarette smoke from Patty's apartment. Guilt, heavy and familiar, settled in Dean's stomach. He'd paid Patty the $45 late fee out of the jar of cash hidden in the flour canister. It was supposed to be for a new winter coat for Leo. Now it was gone, because some rich idiot decided to take a midnight stroll on a crumbling cliff. I know, kiddo. I'll turn the space heater on while you eat, Dean promised, standing up slowly. Oatmeal today. Brown sugar. How's that sound? An hour later, Dean was back in his damp work boots. They hadn't dried completely. His toes were immediately encased in a clammy chill. He dropped Leo off at school, gripping the steering wheel of his Ford as he merged onto the highway. He was running on 3 hours of sleep purely fueled by caffeine and the low-level panic that he might lose his job. Miller, his boss at Coastal Property Solutions, wasn't a forgiving man. Missing the last 3 dock inspections last night was a fireable offense. Miles away in a stark, soundproofed room at St. Jude's Private Hospital in Portland, Sloane was staring at the ceiling. Her fractured rib was taped to her chest, feeling tight and constricted with every shallow breath. The IV line fed a steady stream of fluids and high-grade painkillers into her veins, but she had ordered the nurse to cut the dosage in half. She hated the foggy, detached feeling of the narcotics. She needed her mind sharp. David stood at the foot of her bed, his tablet glowing softly in the dim room. He looked exhausted. His tie slightly loosened, a rare concession to the stress of the last 12 hours. The board has been notified that you suffered a minor slip and are taking a mandatory 48-hour rest, David recited, his tone measured. Stock prices dipped briefly at the rumor of a hospital stay, but rebounded when we issued the press release. Fine, Sloane croaked. Her throat still felt like it had been scoured with steel wool. And the man, David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Sloane, the police consider the matter closed. You slipped a local, pulled you out, he left before giving a statement. It's an anomaly. Why are we chasing a ghost? He's not a ghost, David. He left a shirt. She nodded toward the plastic patient belongings bag sitting on the armchair. He drove a rusted truck. He has a physical footprint. Find him. with what the hospital security cameras in the ER drop-off are notoriously bad. I bribed a night administrator for the footage, just like you asked. It's grainy. All we have is a partial plate on a dark-colored, older model, Ford F-150. Do you know how many of those are registered in Tillamook County, Saugatuck? Then cross-reference the partial plate with local employment records, DMV databases, and property management vendors. Sloane snapped, wincing as the sudden spike in her voice pulled at her rib. Look for manual labor, construction fishing maintenance. He smelled like sawdust and industrial soap. David stared at her, deeply unsettled. He was used to Sloane hunting down corporate acquisitions with this level of predatory focus. Seeing her apply it to a nameless, faceless mechanic was bizarre. It felt like a trauma response. Sloane, please. What is the end game here? You want to send him a basket of muffins. I don't like debts, Sloane said, her dark eyes locking onto his. The vulnerability she had felt in the water, the absolute helplessness, was festering inside her. It felt like an open wound. She needed to close the loop. She needed to look this man in the eye, give him an amount of money that would change his miserable life and re-establish the natural order of things. She needed to buy back her agency. Find the truck, David. By noon, David's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, a small, defeated sigh escaping his lips. Got him, David murmured. Dean Harper, 32, independent contractor for a low-tier property management firm down the coast. Expired tags, 3 outstanding parking tickets. Sloane pushed the thin hospital blanket off her legs. Get my clothes. We're going for a drive. Gravel dusted the gleaming black paint of the Lincoln Navigator as it rolled into the cramped, pothole-riddled lot of Coastal Property Solutions. Inside the SUV, the climate control maintained a perfect 72 degrees. The air smelled of expensive leather and David's subtle cedarwood cologne. Outside, the world was a bleak, monochromatic grey. Rusted dumpsters overflowed with broken drywall and splintered wood. The scent of diesel exhaust and rotting seaweed hung heavy in the damp air. Sloane sat in the back seat, wearing a cashmere turtleneck that hid the severe bruising on her neck and an oversized coat draped over her shoulders. Every bump in the uneven road had felt like a hot knife sliding between her ribs, but her expression remained an unreadable mask. This is the address, David said from the driver's seat, looking out the window with mild disgust. Looks like a maintenance depot. Wait here, Sloane ordered. Sloane, you shouldn't be walking. The doctors work for me, she interrupted, pushing the heavy door open. The cold hit her instantly sharp and biting. She ignored it, stepping carefully onto the uneven dirt. Her Italian leather boots immediately sank into the mud. She walked toward the open bay of a corrugated metal garage. The deafening whine of a power drill echoed from inside, bouncing off the concrete walls. She stepped into the shadows of the garage. It smelled of motor oil, damp earth, and sweat. Underneath, a massive salt-corroded commercial riding mower, a pair of legs stuck out, clad in denim and heavy work boots. Dean Harper, Sloane called out over the noise. The drill stopped. The heavy silence of the garage rushed back in. The man slid out from under the mower on a piece of greasy cardboard. He sat up, wiping his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his fingers. Dean squinted against the light from the open bay doors, trying to make out the silhouette standing there. Then his eyes adjusted. He recognized the pale face. He recognized the stark black hair, now pulled back into a severe knot instead of plastered to her skull with seawater. It was her, the rich idiot. Dean felt an immediate prickling wave of exhaustion wash over him. He tossed the rag onto the concrete. He didn't stand up. His back hurt too much, and he honestly didn't care enough to show her any deference. You're alive, Dean stated flatly, his voice gravelly. Congratulations. How did you find me? "You left your shirt," Sloane said, taking a step closer. She studied him. In the stark light of the hospital, he had just been a blur of wet clothes and panic. Here in his element, he was grounded. He had dark circles under his eyes, grease smeared across his jawline, and a guarded, cynical tightness around his mouth. "Keep it," Dean said, grabbing a wrench and turning back toward the mower. "Consider it a souvenir." Sloane frowned. People did not dismiss her. Ever. "I didn't come here to return a flannel shirt, Mr. Harper. I came to settle a debt." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. She held it out. Dean paused. He looked at the envelope, then slowly up to her face. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He knew exactly what was in there. A check, a massive one. Hush money, gratitude, money, go away money. It was the currency of people who thought every problem in the world could be fixed by throwing zeros at it. Something hot and ugly flared in Dean's chest. He thought of his bruised ribs. He thought of the terrifying moment he thought he was going to drown alongside her. He thought of the $45 he had handed Patty, the money that belonged to his son's warmth. "Put it away," Dean said softly, the edge in his voice sharper than the tools on his bench. Sloane's hand remained extended. "Don't be foolish. There is $100,000 in this envelope. It's a standard compensation package for—" "Compensation." Dean laughed, a dry scraping sound that held zero humor. He finally stood up, his tall frame towering over her despite his slight slouch. He stepped into her personal space. He smelled exactly like he had in the hospital sawdust and cheap soap layered with fresh motor oil. "You don't get to compensate me," Dean said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You don't get to buy a clean conscience. You walked on a condemned cliffside in a gale force storm because you thought the rules didn't apply to you. You almost killed me. You almost left my 6-year-old kid without a father." Sloane flinched. The words hit her harder than the icy water had. Nobody spoke to her like this. Nobody told her no. "Take the money, Dean. It will fix your life. My life isn't broken." Dean lied, his jaw clenching. He looked at her immaculate cashmere, her flawless boots currently sinking into the grime of his reality. "It's just none of your business. Get out of my garage." He turned his back on her, grabbing his drill. The whine of the motor filled the air again, a deliberate wall of noise shutting her out. Sloane stood there for a long moment, the envelope feeling heavy and useless in her hand. For the first time in her adult life, a transaction had failed. The power dynamic hadn't shifted. It had entirely shattered. She turned and walked back out into the cold, the mud clinging stubbornly to her soles, her chest aching with something far more complicated than a broken bone. Mud caked the intricate tread of Sloane's Italian leather boots, drying into a dull grey crust against the pristine floor mats of the Lincoln Navigator. She sat in the cavernous back seat, the heavy door slamming shut behind her, cutting off the abrasive whine of the power drill. The silence inside the SUV was absolute, thick and suffocating. David put the vehicle in drive, his eyes briefly meeting hers in the rearview mirror. He looked thoroughly disturbed. "Back to Portland, then?" David said, his voice tight. It wasn't a question. Sloane didn't answer. She stared out the tinted window as they navigated the cratered driveway of Coastal Property Solutions. She was acutely aware of the envelope still resting in her coat pocket. It felt like a brick of lead. $100,000. To a man working out of a decaying tin shed, it should have been a miracle. Instead, he had looked at it like it was an insult. Her fractured rib gave a sharp, vindictive twinge as the SUV hit a pothole. She pressed her hand against her side. You walked on a condemned cliffside in a gale force storm because you thought the rules didn't apply to you. His voice echoed in her skull. It lacked the smooth, sycophantic polish of the board members and politicians she dealt with daily. It was raw, scraped out of a throat, exhausted by a life she couldn't even fathom. He was right. She had thought the rules didn't apply, and he had paid the physical price for her arrogance. David Hall Sloane said, her voice dropping the gravelly weakness from the hospital, returning to its usual steel-edged cadence. Pull up everything you have on Coastal Property Solutions. The parent company, the LLC structure, their operational debts, their client list. Everything. David's hands tightened on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. Sloane, we are a global tech and logistics conglomerate. We don't acquire regional borderline bankrupt handyman services in Tillamook County. I didn't ask for a portfolio review, David. I asked for the data. By the time the navigator merged onto the interstate, the rain had returned, slicking the asphalt into a dark mirror. Miles behind them, Dean Harper was wiping grease off a wrench with a rag that only smeared the oil further into his calloused palms. Harper, my office. Now. The voice barked from the elevated plywood box that served as the supervisor's office. Dean closed his eyes, exhaling a long, slow breath that tasted of diesel fumes and impending disaster. He tossed the wrench onto the scarred metal workbench. Miller was a man built like a fire plug, permanently sweating and perpetually furious. His office smelled of stale Folgers coffee and cheap peppermint antacids. He didn't look up when Dean walked in, just shoved a messy stack of laminated work orders across his chipped laminate desk. 3 private docs, uninspected. Miller growled, tapping a stubby nicotine-stained finger against the top sheet. The Waverley estate called this morning. A mooring line snapped overnight. Their ski boat is currently beating itself to death against the retaining wall. That's a $10,000 liability, Harper. I had an emergency, Miller. I pulled a woman out of the water down at the cove. I had to take her to the county ER. Miller finally looked up, his eyes hard and unsympathetic. Are you an EMT, Dean? Are you on the county payroll as a lifeguard? No, but she wasn't breathing. Then you call 911 and you finish your goddamn route, Miller snapped, standing up. I don't pay you to play hero. I pay you to check the cleats. I'm docking you 2 days' pay to cover the insurance deductible, and you're off the premium waterfront routes. You're on septic inspection and trash hauling for the rest of the month. Dean's jaw locked. His shin throbbed a violent, hot pulse of pain, demanding acknowledgement. 2 days' pay. He mentally subtracted the numbers. It was the grocery budget. It was the gas money. It was the power bill. You can't do that, Dean said, his voice dangerously low. I just did, Miller replied, sitting back down. Don't like it. The door is right there. I can replace you with a kid fresh out of high school who won't argue by tomorrow morning. Dean stood frozen. The urge to reach across the desk and drag Miller out of his faux leather chair by his collar was a physical, electric hum in his blood. But then he thought of Leo. He thought of the $45 late fee. He swallowed the pride, feeling it scrape down his throat like broken glass. He nodded, once turned and walked out. That evening, the neon sign of Rusty's Diner buzzed with a broken rhythmic flicker, casting a sickly pink glow over the wet parking lot. Dean slid into a torn vinyl booth across from his son. The table was sticky, smelling faintly of bleach and old fryer grease. Leo was aggressively coloring a paper placemat with a blunt red crayon, his small face scrunched in concentration. He was wearing a sweater that was an inch too short in the sleeves. Dad, can I get the pancakes with the chocolate chips? Leo asked, not looking up from his drawing. And the bacon? Dean looked at the menu. The prices had been covered with white stickers, new numbers scrawled in black Sharpie. He felt the familiar heavy knot tighten in his stomach. Yeah, buddy, Dean said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. You can get the bacon. He ordered a black coffee for himself, claiming he wasn't hungry. As he watched Leo enthusiastically drown his food in synthetic syrup, Dean's hand drifted to his jacket pocket. He remembered the heavy cream-colored envelope the woman had held out to him. $100,000. He had rejected it out of pride, out of anger, out of a desperate need to retain some semblance of dignity in a world that constantly stripped it from him. But watching his son eat the only decent meal he'd have all week, Dean felt the crushing, humiliating weight of regret. Pride didn't buy winter coats. Pride didn't pay Patty. He rested his forehead against his knuckles, closing his eyes against the harsh glare of the diner's overhead lights, unaware that 300 miles away, a woman looking out over the Portland skyline was currently buying his entire miserable world. Monday morning brought a biting frost that crystallized the puddles in the Coastal Property Solutions lot. Dean pulled his Ford into its usual spot beside the leaning chain-link fence, the truck's heater rattling in its death throes. He killed the engine, grabbing his heavy canvas coat and mentally preparing himself for a day of hauling wet, rotting debris from the septic yards. But as he stepped out onto the frozen gravel, he stopped. The yard was wrong. The massive rusted dumpster that usually overflowed near the bay doors was gone. In its place sat 3 brand-new heavy-duty commercial work trucks, their pristine white paint gleaming aggressively under the overcast sky. The corrugated metal garage doors, usually screeching and jamming on their tracks, had been replaced entirely. Dean frowned, zipping his coat up to his chin. He walked toward the main office, his boots crunching loudly in the eerie quiet of the yard. Usually by 7 a.m., the air was thick with guys yelling, engines revving, and the smell of cheap cigarettes. Today it was unnervingly orderly. He pulled open the door to the break room. The immediate blast of warm air hit him, followed by a smell that completely short-circuited his brain. It wasn't the burnt, acidic stench of the cheap coffee Miller bought. It was rich, dark roasted espresso. The room was packed. The entire maintenance crew was standing around, clutching steaming paper cups, looking bewildered. At the front of the room, Miller was standing behind the folding table, sweating profusely into his faded polo shirt. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down. Standing next to Miller were 2 men in immaculate charcoal suits, holding sleek tablets. And leaning against the ancient humming vending machine, watching the room with dark, calculating eyes, was Sloane. She wasn't wearing cashmere today. She wore a tailored black blazer over a stark white blouse, her posture radiating absolute, terrifying authority. The bruising on her neck was still faintly visible beneath a silk scarf. Dean stopped dead in the doorway. The ambient noise of the room faded into a dull ringing in his ears. "All right, listen up," Miller stammered, his voice lacking its usual abrasive bark. He cleared his throat violently. "As of Friday night, Coastal Property Solutions has been acquired. We are now a subsidiary of a larger holding company." One of the suits stepped forward, his smile practiced and entirely devoid of warmth. "Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Hayes. I represent the Acquisitions Division of Apex Logistics. Effective immediately, your hourly wages are being adjusted to reflect current state union standards, which equates to an average 40% increase across the board." A stunned silence fell over the room. A guy named Gary, who had worked there for a decade and was missing half a thumb, dropped his plastic stirrer. "Furthermore," the suit continued, "hazardous duty pay is being instated for all septic and deep-water mooring tasks. All out-of-pocket expenses for equipment are to be submitted for immediate reimbursement. Your new health, dental, and vision insurance packets are on the back table." Dean didn't hear the rest. His eyes locked onto Sloane. She was looking directly at him. There was no triumph in her expression, no smug satisfaction. It was an intense, probing stare, waiting to see his move. The meeting broke up into a chaotic, buzzing energy. Men were rushing the back table, grabbing the thick folders of insurance documents like they were winning lottery tickets. Dean ignored them. He walked straight past his co-workers, straight past the suits, and stopped inches from Sloane. "Outside," Dean said. His voice was a flat, deadened instrument. Sloane didn't flinch. She pushed off the vending machine and followed him, the sharp click of her heels sounding like gunfire against the linoleum. He bypassed the front door and shoved open the door to the janitorial supply closet, stepping backward into the cramped, windowless space and pulling her in with him. The door clicked shut, throwing them into dim shadows. The air was thick with the smell of industrial bleach, damp mop heads, and the sudden overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume. The proximity was jarring. In the closet surrounded by mops and buckets, the power dynamic of the boardroom evaporated. They were just two people breathing the same stale air. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Dean asked, his voice shaking with a suppressed violent energy. "I evaluated a failing logistical asset and executed a buyout," Sloane replied smoothly, her chin tilting up. Coastal Property Solutions was drowning in debt and OSHA violations. I restructured it. It's business. "Don't give me corporate garbage," Dean snapped, stepping closer. The toe of his scuffed boot hit the tip of her designer shoe. "You didn't buy a regional trash hauling service because it's a good asset. You bought it because I told you to take your money and shove it. You told me your life wasn't broken." Sloane fired back her composure, cracking just a fraction, revealing the sharp frustration beneath. "Yet your employer docked you 2 days' pay for saving my life. He routinely forces you to work with compromised safety gear. You are drowning, Dean. You just refuse to let anyone throw you a rope. Because it's a leash." Dean hit the metal shelving unit next to him, making a bucket clatter to the floor. The sound was deafening in the small space. He breathed heavily, staring down at her. "You think because you have more money than God, you can just purchase my life? You can just overwrite my reality because you don't like feeling indebted to a mechanic?" Sloane stared up at him. She could see the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes, the tight clench of his jaw. He was furious, but he hadn't walked out. "I didn't buy your life," Sloane said quietly, her voice dropping, losing its boardroom edge. She reached out her fingers, lightly brushing the rough frayed canvas of his coat. "I bought the people who were exploiting it. I doubled your salary, Dean. I gave your son health insurance. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, then fine. Hate me." She stepped back, her hand falling to her side. She reached for the doorknob. "But you aren't going to quit," she said, looking over her shoulder, her dark eyes piercing his. "Because you're too good of a father to throw away a 40% raise out of spite. See you on the yard, Mr. Harper." She opened the door and walked out into the fluorescent glare of the hallway, leaving Dean standing in the dark, suffocating smell of bleach, entirely trapped by a woman he couldn't afford to fight, and suddenly wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. Plastic chairs scraped against the faded linoleum of the county pediatric clinic. Dean sat rigidly, his large frame awkwardly folded into a seat designed for children, holding a crisp, heavy-stock piece of paper. It was a temporary insurance card. The Apex Logistics logo was embossed in the corner, sleek and predatory. He stared at it until the letters blurred. For 3 years, a trip to this clinic meant draining the flour canister of every wrinkled $20 bill he possessed. It meant rationing Leo's asthma inhalers, telling the boy to just breathe slowly when the wheezing started a lie that tasted like ash in Dean's mouth. Mr. Harper, the receptionist, a woman who usually looked at him with a mixture of pity and impatience, was smiling. "Leo is all set. The new policy cleared immediately. 0 copay for the preventative exam, and the new inhaler prescription is fully covered at the pharmacy next door." Dean swallowed hard. The knot of chronic anxiety that lived permanently at the base of his skull loosened just a fraction. He nodded, unable to articulate the humiliating, overwhelming wave of relief crashing over him. "Thank you." He walked out into the biting December air holding Leo's hand. He had the medicine. He had a full tank of gas. He had a paycheck coming Friday that was double what he was used to. He had everything he needed, and yet an uncomfortable heavy resentment settled in his chest. He hated that she had done this. He hated that a woman he barely knew could effortlessly erase his deepest terrors with a single signature. It made him feel incredibly small. 2 days later, Dean was crouched on the edge of a private mahogany dock in Tillamook Bay. The wind was brutal, whipping the grey water into whitecaps that slammed against the pilings. He was resecuring a massive galvanized cleat, his gloved hands moving with practiced mechanical efficiency. He was back on the premium routes. Miller hadn't spoken to him since the buyout, avoiding Dean like he carried a contagious disease. A sharp click of footsteps on the wooden planks cut through the sound of the wind. Dean didn't look up. He knew the cadence of that walk. Sloane stopped a few feet away. She was wearing a heavy wool peacoat, her collar turned up against the freezing spray. The severe knot in her hair was gone, the dark strands blowing wildly around her pale face. "You're a long way from the boardroom," Dean said, driving a heavy lag bolt into the wood with his drill. The noise was deafening, a deliberate barrier he erected between them. He released the trigger. The silence rushed back in, filled only by the sloshing water. "I'm inspecting the newly acquired regional assets," Sloane replied. Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight suppressed wince as she shifted her weight. The broken rib was still plaguing her. "This is a residential dock. We just maintain it." Dean finally stood up, wiping his gloved hands on his canvas pants. He looked down at her. "You don't need to be out here in this cold. Your point was made, Ms. Sloane. You bought the company. You saved the peasants. You can go back to Portland now." Sloane's jaw tightened. She looked out at the churning grey water, her dark eyes reflecting the bleak sky. She hadn't gone back. David had been practically begging her to return to headquarters. There were mergers to approve board members to placate. But every time she thought about getting in the helicopter, her chest seized. And it wasn't just the fractured bone. It was the memory of the dark water closing over her, and the sudden violent realization of how empty her meticulously curated life actually was. "I don't want to go back yet," she said quietly. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. Dean paused. He studied her profile. She looked tired. The invincible billionaire armor was slipping, revealing something brittle underneath. "Why?" he asked, his tone losing its sharp edge. She turned to look at him. "Because everyone in Portland looks at me like I'm a walking bank account or a stepping stone. When I was drowning, my net worth didn't matter. The water didn't care. And when you pulled me out," she hesitated, the admission catching in her throat, "you didn't care either. You just saw a human being." Dean felt a sudden, uncomfortable heat rising in his neck. He looked away, focusing on the rusted chains of the mooring line. "I just saw a body. I didn't want the paperwork of a corpse on my shift." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Sloane took a step closer. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across Dean's jacket. She smelled of expensive cedarwood and the sharp ozone of the approaching storm. "You kept the money." Sloane noted her eyes dropping to the pocket of his coat where the envelope had been days ago. "I gave it back to your suit." "Hayes," Dean corrected, his voice hardening again. "I took the raise. I took the insurance, because my son needs it, and I'm not proud enough to let him freeze to prove a point to you. But I didn't take your charity." A strange, complex emotion flickered across Sloane's face. It wasn't frustration. It was respect. Deep, unsettling respect. She was used to people taking whatever she offered, greedy and compliant. Dean's absolute refusal to be bought, his stubborn adherence to his own fractured dignity, was a gravity she had never encountered. "You missed a bolt," Sloane said softly, pointing a gloved finger at the base of the cleat. Dean looked down. He hadn't missed it. He was about to drill it. But he let the comment slide. He crouched back down the drill, whining to life, acutely aware that she didn't walk away. She stood there in the freezing wind, watching him work, anchoring herself to the only real thing she had touched in a very long time. Rain hammered against the thin aluminum roof of Dean's mobile home, a deafening metallic drumming that vibrated right through the floorboards. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap vegetable oil and frying onions. Dean stood at the tiny stove, prodding a skillet of ground beef with a plastic spatula. The space heater in the corner buzzed aggressively, fighting a losing battle against the drafts leaking through the warped window frames. At the cramped laminate dining table, Leo was asleep, his cheek pressed against a math workbook, a blue crayon still clutched in his fist. Dean turned the burner off, running a heavy grease-stained hand over his face. He was exhausted. The physical labor of the docks was brutal, but it was the mental exhaustion of the past 2 weeks that was grinding his bones to dust. He couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He couldn't stop expecting a pristine white truck or a dark-eyed woman in designer wool to appear at the edge of his vision. Headlights suddenly swept across the thin, faded curtains of the living room, casting long, moving shadows across the worn carpet. Dean froze. The engine rumble was deep, smooth, and entirely out of place in this gravel lot filled with dying sedans and rusted pickups. A heavy vehicle door slammed shut. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door, pulling it open before the knock even came. Sloane stood on his sagging wooden porch. She held a large black umbrella that deflected the worst of the torrential downpour, but the hem of her dark slacks was already soaked. In her free hand, she held a neatly folded square of red and black fabric. "You're out of your mind," Dean said, his voice flat, staring at her through the screen door. "You have no business being in this neighborhood at night." "I brought your shirt back," Sloane said. She didn't sound like a CIO. She sounded hesitant. Dean pushed the screen door open, stepping aside. He didn't invite her in, but he left the space wide enough for her to cross the threshold. She collapsed the umbrella, leaving it dripping on the porch, and stepped inside. The trailer was incredibly small. Her presence immediately overwhelmed the space. She looked around her eyes, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the frayed upholstery of the single armchair, the sleeping child at the table. She didn't look at it with disgust. She looked at it with an intense, quiet calculation, absorbing the reality of his daily survival. "I had it dry cleaned," Sloane murmured, offering the flannel shirt. Dean took it. It was wrapped in thin plastic and smelled of harsh chemical lavender. The sawdust and salt were entirely gone. It felt sterile. He tossed it onto the counter next to the sputtering stove. "Thanks," he muttered. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the cheap cabinetry. "Did your assistant map this out for you, slumming it on a Tuesday night?" Sloane flinched slightly. "David doesn't know I'm here. I drove myself." Dean raised an eyebrow. The thought of this woman navigating the treacherous, potholed coastal roads in the dark without a driver was strangely alarming. "Why?" "Because I leave for Tokyo tomorrow," she said, her dark eyes finally locking onto his. The stark, overhead kitchen light caught the shadows under her cheekbones. "I have a 3-week acquisition tour. I'm going back to the boardroom, Dean." "Good. That's where you belong." "Is it?" The question hung in the humid air between them, heavy and dangerous. She stepped closer to him, invading the tiny space of the kitchenette. "For 10 years, I've built an empire by calculating risk and exploiting weakness. I control thousands of people. I have everything. And yet when I was in that water, all of it amounted to absolutely nothing. You dragged me out of the dark. It was just reflex, Dean said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He could smell her perfume again, cutting through the scent of frying onions. It was intoxicating. He hated it. Don't make it a fairy tale. I'm a mechanic Sloane. I fix broken things for rich people. That's it. You fixed my company, she countered softly. You forced me to look at the rust under the paint. You forced me to see the human cost of a spreadsheet. She reached out. This time she didn't touch his coat. Her cool, manicured fingers brushed against the raw, bruised skin of his knuckles resting on his arm. The contact sent a violent jolt straight up Dean's spine. He sucked in a breath, his muscles locking instantly. He should step away. He knew exactly how this ended. He was a temporary fascination, a gritty working-class souvenir from her near-death experience. When she boarded that jet to Tokyo, the reality of her world would wash him away like the tide. But he didn't move. The crushing loneliness of the past 5 years, the endless cycle of debt and exhaustion, suddenly felt unbearable in the face of her touch. You're playing a dangerous game. Dean warned, his voice, rough, scraping against his throat. He uncrossed his arms, his large, calloused hand hovering inches from her waist, not quite daring to touch the expensive silk of her blouse. You don't want this. You want the idea of this. Stop telling me what I want, Sloane whispered, fiercely closing the distance between them. She looked up at him, the cynical, hardened billionaire entirely gone, replaced by a woman who was terrified, breathless, and desperately seeking an anchor. And before Dean's bruised pride could scream at him to stop, he closed his hand around her waist, pulling her hard against his chest. Her mouth was desperate bruising and entirely uncalculated. Dean tasted expensive mint toothpaste and the faint metallic tang of his own bitten lip from hours ago. His calloused hand snagged on the fine silk of her blouse, a harsh, abrasive, rasping sound in the quiet kitchen. He expected her to pull away in immediate disgust at the grease permanently ingrained in his cuticles to remember who she was and what he was. But she didn't. She anchored her fingers in his hair, her heavy platinum rings cold against his scalp. It wasn't a romance movie kiss. It was a violent collision. It was two people trying to breathe underwater. The space heater in the corner clicked loudly, its internal thermostat abruptly shutting off the fan. At the dining table, Leo shifted. His math workbook slid an inch across the laminate with a dry, papery scrape. He mumbled something in his sleep, tossing his head. Dean tore himself away. His chest heaved. He stepped back the back of his knees, hitting the cheap cabinetry with a dull thud. The physical distance between them was only a foot, but it felt like a canyon suddenly ripping open in the floorboards. Sloane's lips were swollen, her pristine, terrifying composure entirely wrecked. She looked wild. She looked incredibly, painfully real. "I have to go," she whispered. Her chest rose and fell unsteadily beneath the wrinkled silk. Dean gave a short, bitter nod, wiping the back of his hand across his mouth. The reality of the trailer, the peeling linoleum, the lingering smell of burnt onions, the draft creeping under the door, rushed back in, suffocating him. He was an idiot. He had let himself forget the gravity of their respective worlds. "I know," Dean said, his voice dropping back into its familiar gravelly cynicism. "Tokyo. I'll come back." Dean grabbed the damp dish towel off the counter, gripping it until his knuckles turned white. "Don't do that, Sloane. Don't make promises from the slums. You'll get on that Gulf Stream tomorrow. You'll look down at this wet, miserable coastline, and you'll realize this was just adrenaline, a trauma bond. You'll go back to your boardrooms and your acquisitions, and this will just be a story you tell at a dinner party." She stared at him, her jaw setting into that familiar, rigid line of authority. She didn't argue. She knew his cynicism was a shield, thick and heavily dented by years of being worn down. She picked up her umbrella, leaving a small puddle of rainwater on his scuffed floor. "Watch the news, Dean," she said softly. The front door clicked shut. The heavy engine of the Navigator rumbled to life, tires crunching over the gravel as she drove away into the downpour. Dean stood in the kitchen for a long time, the silence ringing violently in his ears. He finally moved, walking over to the table, gently picking up his sleeping son and carrying him to the narrow bed down the hall. 3 weeks felt like a decade. The Oregon winter settled in a relentless, grinding parade of grey skies and freezing sleet. Dean worked. The new paychecks cleared. He bought Leo a heavy, waterproof winter coat that actually fit. He paid a mechanic to fix the Ford's heater. He paid Patty 2 weeks in advance. The crippling, suffocating panic of poverty began to recede, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache in his chest that he didn't know how to navigate. He hated himself for checking his phone. He sat in the cab of his truck during lunch breaks, eating sandwiches that didn't taste like despair anymore, scrolling through financial news sites on his cracked screen. Sloan orchestrates hostile takeover in Tokyo. Apex Logistics expands Asian market footprint. There were photos of her. Immaculate. Untouchable. Flanked by men in tailored suits, her dark eyes cold, calculating, and entirely detached. Dean locked his screen, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. He was a fool. He had let the smell of her cedarwood perfume and the desperation of a single raw moment rewrite his common sense. She was a billionaire. He was a dock worker. Gravity always wins. It was a Tuesday when the storm finally broke. The heavy clouds fractured, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron and a biting, crystal-clear cold. Dean was at the municipal marina, driving a massive, galvanized bolt into a replaced piling. The pneumatic impact wrench echoed like machine gun fire across the flat water. He dropped the heavy tool, rolling his shoulders to work out a deep knot in his trapezius. He smelled it before he heard her. Cedarwood and the sharp ozone of the sea. He turned. Sloan was standing on the wooden dock. She wasn't wearing cashmere. She wasn't wearing silk. She wore heavy denim thick wool socks and a practical insulated canvas work jacket that looked remarkably similar to his own. Her black hair was pulled back into a messy practical braid. Dean froze. His heart hammered a violent, erratic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't speak. He just stared, waiting for the illusion to shatter, waiting for his exhausted brain to realize he was hallucinating. "The Tokyo acquisition closed," Sloan said. Her voice carried easily over the gentle slosh of the tide against the wood. "It was the most profitable, aggressive deal of my entire career, and I hated every single second of it." She walked closer. The damp planks creaked under her leather boots. "I stepped down as CEO yesterday morning." She continued, stopping a few feet away. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her cheek. "I retained my board seat. I hired a proxy to run the daily operations, and I bought a house on the South Ridge, the one with the reinforced bedrock foundation. Not the crumbling cliff." Dean swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. "Why?" "Because I don't want to rule the world anymore," she said, her dark eyes entirely stripped of their corporate armor. They were open, terrifyingly vulnerable, and locked onto his. "I just want to live in it, and I don't want to live in it without you." Dean looked at her. He saw the absolute, terrifying leap she was taking. She had dismantled her empire for the muddy, imperfect reality of his life. He looked at his own hands, scarred, calloused, stained with a decade of hard labor. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance. He didn't ask if she was sure. He just reached out his rough fingers, tangling securely with hers. The contrast was stark. The reality was going to be incredibly messy. but as she let out a shaky breath and stepped into his chest, the freezing coastal wind entirely ignored them. Dean and Sloane's worlds couldn't be further apart, but sometimes survival requires a violent collision. He saved her from the freezing ocean, and in return, she pulled him out of a life drowning in debt and despair. It wasn't a neat, perfect fairy tale. It was messy, raw, and entirely real. They didn't bridge the gap with money, but with the gritty, undeniable human connection of two people who desperately needed an anchor. If you loved this grounded emotional journey of unexpected rescue and gritty romance, smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe today for more epic storytelling videos.